Jacob and Joseph in particular and his family. But, they became many and powerful. And when we read this chapter, they were always multiplying, but not just in numbers, but they were successful people, right? And what we see in this chapter, that no matter what they tried to do to them, they were still growing. And this is, I believe, the underlying theme, and the message is that you can't stop God in his doings. Right? They came small, and they started growing, and they're trying to use different means to stop them, but they just can't do that because God is behind. So the book of Exodus will actually finish with God in the sanctuary, in the cloud of his glory in the sanctuary. So it kind of God wins, and his presence is amongst his people. And the presence of God and God's providential activities and God's plans that are being fulfilled can't be stopped. Right? God is going to accomplish what he promised that he will accomplish for his people. And that's the main message of the book of Exodus, right? And I think it's very important. Now, the second, the Exodus 1:7 says here, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mightily, and the land was filled with them. And later on, when you read chapter 12, verse 37, you find that there were 600,000 men. 600,000 men that left Egypt. Now, that's just men. What about women? What about children? And they had lots of children. So you could have, per one man, you could have another 3, 4, 10, additional people. So it could have been 2 million, it could have been 5 million, 6 million, we don't know, but it was a lot of people. Okay. So what is this chapter telling us? What is it telling us about why they wanted to exterminate them? What was Pharaoh's issue? Here we see verses 8 through 11. Verse 9 says, he said to people, look, the people of children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Now, I don't know if we should take this literally, but if we would take this literally, that means that they outnumbered the people in Egypt. I didn't check, whether we have any other sources that would tell us whether this is kind of figure of speech or a literal statement, but that was the idea. They were afraid that the Jews are taking over, and therefore we must eliminate them. And unfortunately, we see that throughout the history, not just with Jewish nation, but generally speaking, people removing powerful men, powerful political groups, even nations, because they may become a threat. So it's like a preventative measure. Let's do that before they become stronger than us. And in reality, world politics, if you follow any of it, if you had followed in your life, you see that, those who are in power always make sure that those others don't develop, beyond measure. Keep them there. We're going to be here in every way, whether economically, militarily, or any other way. They can't be stronger than the strongest. Otherwise, the strongest will be in jeopardy. So it's an old recipe. Okay, so what did they try to do? How did they attempt to initially to stop Israelites from growing exceedingly?
They had some midwives, and if the male children were born, then they were going to put them to death. And that way they thought they could control it better. But the midwives, they didn't do that. Some of them didn't do that.
So it seems like they didn't want to kill them all just like that, but they just wanted them to stop multiplying and growing. Sister Roswitha?
Also, they enslaved them because they thought they were going to get too strong. So they put harsh labor over them, and to keep them down.
Okay, so they wanted to suppress them, make them unhappy, enslave them. And we know that that oppression wasn't just for the sake of, let's make them leave, because Pharaoh didn't want to let them go, right? But they used torture and oppression to, I guess, make them die sooner or something. And they wanted to make sure that all male children were killed. Now, one thing that we need to know, when we look at the history, as long as the father was of a certain ethnic background, in this case Egyptian, the child will be Egyptian. Many pharaohs, many kings were marrying wives from different countries, but children were still considered Jewish. And we see that even in the Bible, right? Even in Jesus' genealogy, you have women who are not, and we mentioned it, like Ruth being one of them, who were not of Jewish descent, but because the husband was, Moses' wife was from a Median tribe, right? So as long as the husband was a Jew, so any children born of a Jewish man, even if that man married an Egyptian woman, would still be considered Jewish. And vice versa. They didn't bother with women staying alive because they will eventually need to marry who? Egyptians, and kids will become or be considered Egyptian. So that was the whole idea, historical idea and approach, and we know that for fact, because many kings later on during the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, they were marrying wives from different countries, and that wasn't an issue. Okay. So, but these midwives, now do we know their names? What were their names? Midwives. Shifra and Puah. Now, one interesting fact that the lesson brings out is that these midwives were mentioned by name. What about Pharaoh? Do we have Pharaoh's name? We have Pharaoh's name. And we have names of the Jacob's family listed. You have midwives' name. But Pharaoh's name is not listed. Now, you would expect that a powerful leader such as Pharaoh would be acknowledged in such a way that his name was mentioned, right? But it wasn't. Can you imagine, any dignitary coming visiting this country and they just say, well, the president of such and such country came, and they don't mention his name, his wife's name, and all those things that we do to recognize someone, we mention his name. How many times have you been embarrassed because you forgot someone's name? And they came and they're greeting you and they say, hey, hi Eunice, hi Laura, hi Roswitha, and you're like, hi, but you don't remember their name. It happens to me regularly, as a pastor. I greet and meet a lot of people. Sometimes people, hey, Pastor X. As a matter of fact, I met one person recently in Sacramento Adventist Academy, and young woman, she was like, "Hey, Pastor Sasha, I didn't know your kids went to Sacramento Adventist Academy," and I'm looking at her, and I'm like, "You look so familiar." This is me thinking, but not out loud. I was like, "You look so familiar, but I have no clue who you are." Well, later on, I figured out who she was and whose daughter she is. And they were coming to this. They'd come for the concerts and perform as a family. But I'm like, man, that's embarrassing when you don't know someone's name. Well, obviously, Pharaoh wasn't mentioned by name, but these two seemingly insignificant, good morning, Sister Johnny, welcome. These two seemingly insignificant people, it seems like it would be enough to say two midwives. Doesn't matter what's their name, right? For us, it's only important to know what they've done. But no, they were mentioned by name. And it reminds me of, you remember when Mary anointed Jesus' feet, what Jesus said? That the story about that will be told throughout generations so that people would remember what she has done and honor her. So we know who did it, we know what. So same here, it seems like that Bible, or the author of the Bible, who is ultimately God, wanted us to remember these two names, Shifra and Pua. God wanted to respect them. It would have been enough just to know what they had done and remember their faithfulness, but God said, no, I want you to remember their names. I want you to know them, right? And there's something about that, and the Bible sometimes talks about it, God knowing our name, knowing, the number of our hair, knowing us. And then Bible also talks about those whose names won't be mentioned anymore, or whose names will be forgotten. And the Bible is full of those expressions. So there's that idea of the, name being remembered or name being forgotten, depending on, influence that one exerted in his life. And I hope that we will all strive to be remembered, right, in this way, like these two faithful ladies, and they did risk their lives. And it's really amazing story and an amazing display of courage. They risked their lives. Now, did God reward them because of that? Did you notice that in the text? Did God reward them? Reward midwives? Yeah. The text actually says that, right? That God blessed them for their faithfulness. Okay. So, what happened afterwards? So, when this fell through, they were supposed to do what? When we continue reading, it says, so the verse 18. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done these things and saved the male children alive?" Right? He comes and asks, and they answer, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are lively and gave birth before the midwives come to them." Yeah, they were a little sneaky, and therefore God dealt with midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So, and it was because the midwives feared God that He provided households for them. So God actually blessed them. And it's interesting how here, they're actually, they didn't speak truth. They said Hebrew women are kind of stronger, and they just deliver before we ever show up. Right? So it wasn't really a truthful statement, but God still blessed them. Now, you know, of course, this is not to be used an excuse to lie. And we can treat with this in two different, we can approach this in two different ways. One is, God just forgave them because they've done it out of the goodness of their heart. God just forgave them. But then, there's also that idea in Jewish theology, I know I mentioned it before, pikuach nefesh, preservation of human life. And during the Holocaust, Jews have underlined that. And not everyone will agree with that concept, but it's unfortunately biblical. Unfortunately, it's fortunately biblical, I should say. And that's that preservation of human life takes precedence for God, you know. And Jews needed to say that because people were hiding Jews, right, in their basements or whatever, and lying about no one being there, right? Because for them it was more important to protect children and women or whoever was in the basement than to just give them into the hands of those who will execute them or take them to, you know, Auschwitz or one of those camps. So, and that's what we see here, you know, and we see it in the Bible many times. But, you know, it's not to be used as an excuse to commit evil. But we see that God was willing to at least turn a blind eye on those things if people were actually striving to save someone's life, and it wasn't for the personal gain or anything, but to actually help someone. And, you know, in our understanding of morality, sometimes we look at things black and white, and we should, but, you know, there's also sometimes flexibility that we read about in the Bible. Okay, so how did Moses then survive? You know, this story is kind of an introduction into Moses's birth and upbringing, and it kind of lays the stage. And does it remind you of the story of Jesus and Herod? You remember what Herod was doing? When Magi came to Herod and asked him, where is the king that was born, what did Herod do, King Herod? Remember, he ordered, you know, slaying of children up to 2 years old. So it's kind of a similar thing, trying to cover all, right? Cover the basis and basically prevent Messiah from being born. And Moses is here like a Messiah of a kind, right? He's the one who will deliver, and in such a way he foreshadows what Jesus will do. Okay. So what's interesting in the story of Moses? How did Moses survive? Another interesting screenplay.
His mom, when that decree was for the males, first male of every family, Hebrew family, she made a basket and put him in it and set him on the Nile, and his sister watched after him and made sure he was safe. And the Lord took him to the Pharaoh's daughter.
Okay, go ahead.
And right before that, she hid him for 3 months. And so she couldn't hide him anymore. So probably getting bigger and crying a little louder. And so that's where Laura's story begins.
It's interesting that she did what Pharaoh requested, right? She put him in the river. Put him in the river, and God took care of it. And it's to me, it's just amazing what God can do and how He can open doors even in impossible situations. And both of these chapters are basically setting a stage for the impossible. And the whole book of Exodus is impossible, right? You have people going through the desert and water, shooting from the rock, and the cloud covering them during the day, and the fire during the night, and God feeding the manna, and everything is so miraculous, and everything is possible because of God. So here we see that the only reason why Moses was able to be born was faithfulness and determination. It wasn't just God. God wanted to save them, and God will eventually send Moses. But it was also because of the faithfulness of people. These midwives, Moses' parents, his sister, you remember from the story, she was hiding there between the reeds, right, by the river, waiting to see what's going to happen to her brother. And then Pharaoh's daughter and her servants found the baby, and she kind of appeared conveniently there and said, by the way, it seems like that the baby is Jewish. I happen to know one Jewish lady who could nurse him, right? And it's just unbelievable what God can do. So she gets to raise Moses, mom, right? So God not only saved Moses' life, God made sure that she can raise Moses, actually. Yeah. And not just teach him, but raise him for God. And that's a beautiful testimony. We all go through hardships and of life, but if we remain faithful, God can work with us and through us and do amazing things that we will marvel at. Okay, so what else is interesting here? In this story, yeah, she was paid as well. Did you notice that? Verse 9, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So not only she got to raise her child, she was paid for that. And it's blessing upon blessing, as the Gospel of John says.
Pastor,
Yes.
do you think that maybe with her paying her, she was treated a little better too than their family, than other slave families?
I believe so. And she was protected too. No one could touch that family because she was raising Pharaoh's daughter's son. From that point on, everyone knew who she was, because I'm sure that Pharaoh's daughter was regularly coming there to visit, or she was going to the palace, and if she raised him, like we believe, till he was 12 years old, then she made quite a few trips to the palace, or they came to her, or however that was arranged. And all those, important people, and guard, and whoever else was involved, they all knew who this woman was. Anyone knows her name? It's hard. Starts with J. Yeah. That's Pharaoh's daughter, Hatshepsut. That's Pharaoh's daughter's name. But Moses' mom's name is, and I hope I'll pronounce it well, Jochebed, something like that. Jochebed, yeah. Yes. Excellent questions. Excellent question. And you just helped me really, because I'm like, I almost covered the story superficial. I'm like, okay, what do we talk about now? Well, the question is, would this be one of the first stories where God had a plan that he was going to fulfill through someone? So it was part of God's providential activity. They're all part of the, good morning, Sister Cheryl, part of the bigger picture. Yes, definitely yes, because especially in chapter 3, when we read when God extends the call to Moses. This is just upbringing, but chapter 3 is when God will invite Moses to perform this task. God tells him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, and then he's basically telling him, I made the promise to Abraham that I will create a nation and the whole world will be blessed through you. I made the promise. I made a covenant with them. And this is why I'm here. So God is not only here because they cried out to him, right? God came, and the whole story of Moses is in response to their prayers because of the hardship, right? But there is more to it, and that God promised his faithfulness to them and that he will be their God. And he comes and says, basically, I want you to know that I did not abandon you. You know, I'm still here. And he comes as a part of, so it's really not about Moses. And if anything, this book is about God, not about Moses, really. This is the book where Moses will ask God, show me your glory. In chapters 33, 34, so 34, 5 through 6, God reveals himself as God who is long-suffering, merciful and gracious, and abounding in mercy. So God revealing his character. The book ends with God's glory in the tabernacle, God's presence. So this book is about God being faithful to his people, fulfilling his promise, his ability to do miracles, to deliver, his desire to be present. And that's the real value of this book is in that actual question, and that this is part of the bigger picture. And all of us are part of the bigger picture. Sometimes we just think of ourselves, our salvation, our needs, but it's really not just about us. We're part of the bigger picture, and if we think that we're going through hardships, well, they did, but they were part of the bigger picture, something that God wanted to accomplish. So yes, definitely yes. And that's how we are supposed to study, actually, the book of Exodus. Three main features. I'll kind of I'm going to make a little digression. I read a good book this week, how we should read the book of Exodus. Actually, a chapter. How to read the book of Exodus. And the main thing that we have to keep in mind is that a book of Exodus, three main focal points are deliverance from Egypt, number one. Number two, laws. God gives them laws. He establishes his nation. For them to be a nation, they need to have laws. Every nation has laws that regulate life. So deliverance, God delivers them, gives them law, and then abides amongst them. So deliverance, law, and God's presence in that order. And that's the main message of the book, right? And it's God's desire to deliver us. When he delivers us, he tells us how to live and what to do. And if we agree, he'll be present in our lives, right? Again, in that order. You don't keep the law of God, and you can't keep the law of God before he delivers you, right? And that's why even the Ten Commandments begin with, you remember what God tells them. What is the first commandment? Yes. Why? Because I delivered you, he says. Right? So God delivered them and then gave them 10 commandments. And then he told them, build me a sanctuary. And then he said, I'm going to abide there. You know, there's certain conditions. God brings us on his soil, his turf. And there's rules there or something that's necessary for spirituality and for harmony. And God basically told them this is the minimum that we need to establish so that we can live together, right? Another thought is that you know, the book of Exodus resolves the issue and the tension created in the Garden of Eden because they needed to leave God's presence. And the book of Exodus brings God's presence back amongst his people. And basically the tabernacle is like the Garden of Eden. That's where they walk with God. That's where they meet God. And you know, a lot was written about that as well. So it is a beautiful book, and I think rather than just looking at the stories, we need to look, you know, ask deeper questions. Why? Why is God telling us these things and not something else? He's trying to tell us something. And in this particular case, as I'm reading about people who cried out to God, who are suffering, and God heard them, and because they're faithful, there's miracles, it tells me, you know, press on. God sees you. God is faithful. If he promised, he will deliver. He won't forsake you, right? He keeps his promises. And that's wonderful too. And even as I was preparing my sermon for today, going through the book of Jeremiah, there's that sense that God has more, and I don't know if that's true, but it's just a feeling that I have as I'm reading. It's almost as if God is more merciful towards those that he established covenant with, or they established with them, than those that didn't. And so that's interesting, yeah. When someone becomes his person, God pursues them. You know, and the story of Egyptian slavery, or even more so Babylonian slavery, is very instrumental, or in that context, because God will punish all the nations for their sins, but eventually Israel is the only one that comes out as the one that God delivers. But anyway, that's another story. Okay, so what else is? Do you have any questions? Actually, we kind of covered the story, the basic. Moses means drawn out, or one who is drawn out of water, right? That's what we saw. Yes. Yes. Nice. Thank you for sharing. Yes. And good midwife was very important. Right? And maybe that's the reason why Pharaoh didn't punish them, because he needed these two women. They must have been the best. I don't know. And okay, let me see. Let me look at my notes. Yeah, maybe I referenced that, but Exodus 2, 24 and 25, if someone would like to read. Mm-hmm. Exodus 2, 24 and 25.
So God heard
Mm-hmm.
So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them.
So you see, verse 24 emphasizes that God remembered his covenant. God didn't forget. They were not forsaken. While the Bible doesn't give all the details, I mean, we know, we really need to go to back to the story of Jacob to understand what's happening. Because, Jacob was a nice man, but a little reckless too in some ways. And his children, some of them wanted to kill Joseph, then eventually they settled on selling him. And he ended up in Egypt. So what happened to them afterwards was basically they set up a stage for that. And now God did spare their lives, and Joseph spared their lives, but they ended up in Egypt because of what I've done to Joseph. Right? So all these things that are happening, God didn't send them to Egypt. Yes, there was famine in the land and everything, but I almost believe that in a way they were kind of paying for, the sins of their fathers or something like that. But God didn't forget them, just like he won't forget them in Babylon. God sent them to Babylon, but he didn't forget them, and he told them, you're going to stay there for 70 years, and then I will bring you back, and I will punish Babylon. But sometimes some things happen for a reason, or they're product of human sin, mistake, something along that line. And but God didn't forget. That's important thing. God remembered his covenant, and the whole book will emphasize the value of the covenant and God establishing the covenant with his people through Moses, ratifying it with blood of the animals, and the book is really about God's faithfulness, because we can turn it into a book about Moses and about Israel. And sometimes we do that because we focus on the details, human details that interest us. But it's very important to keep in mind that every book of the Bible is really about God. And to an extent about how we should relate to him and what's our role in it, right? It's about us too, in a way, what we should become and what we are expected to be. But it is really about God. Any other questions? guess it's clear. Yeah, the lesson was pretty easy, pretty clear, and that's how Professor Moscala actually, that's his style. Very organized, very clear, easy to follow. And I like that. So for maybe I could say this. So 5 books of Moses, which is Genesis to Deuteronomy, right? They are supposed to be read together. There's an overlap to a certain extent, but there's also a unique message that they convey when they're read together. They're popularly called Pentateuch or Torah, really, amongst Jews, amongst Christian scholars is Pentateuch, which is 5 books, and but Torah, which means instruction. Hebrew Bible, which they call Tanakh, has 3 parts. One is Torah, the other one is prophets, and the third one is the book of wisdom, books of wisdom, Psalms, Solomon's books and others, including the book of Daniel is amongst the book of wisdom, because the book of Daniel keeps repeating that God makes people wise. I don't know if you noticed that. So there is an emphasis on wisdom. So even though it's a prophetic book, it talks about the real wisdom that God can give you, an insight, right? Because the prophet is the one who has wisdom, who sees, who has answers, right? But anyway, so Torah is the foundational book. And there are Jews, like for example, Samaritan Jews and Sadducees are like that too, who accepted only Torah. That's foundational book. Everything else, prophets, chronicles, and later prophetic books are important to most Jews and to us, but Torah is considered foundational because it contains the story of creation, the story of God's revelation, and it's foundational for the whole Bible. And later Jesus will quote from it, and pretty much every book of the Bible is leans on this story. New Testament, Adam and Eve are being mentioned, and all those stories, Abraham, in Gospels, in writings of Apostle Paul, and yeah. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. We have a few more minutes, but unless you have any other question, I would say read it, study it. Online you can access the teachers' materials as well for free. And you can just go to Sabbath School website and find teachers' materials as well. And that's also helpful. Okay, well, I think we can pray now. Father in heaven, we thank you for this wonderful lesson and wonderful book, the book of Exodus. We pray that you would bless us to really understand the deep messages that you preserved for us, especially to see you as a faithful God who remembers his covenant and he's more than willing to deliver, but who will also ask us to order our lives according to your law, so that we can remain in the relationship with you. We pray that you would continue to bless us today, that you would bless our worship, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.